This morning, friends, for a reading from the Gospel according to Luke. We'll be sharing from the latter part of the 16th chapter, Luke chapter 16, starting with verse 19. I'll be sharing from the Common English Bible this morning. If that's not your translation, you brought a Bible with you, and it's a little bit different from that, that is okay. This is not the ancient Greek, but it's a translation of it. And somewhere in between the words on your page and the words on mine, there is a word that God will speak to us together. A reading from Luke. There was a certain rich man who clothed himself in purple and fine linen and feasted luxuriously every day. At his gate lay a certain poor man named Lazarus, who was covered with sores. Lazarus longed to eat the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. Instead, dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried by angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. While being tormented in the place of the dead, he looked up and saw Abraham at a distance with Lazarus at his side. He shouted, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I'm suffering in this flame." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received good things, whereas Lazarus received terrible things. Now Lazarus is being comforted, and you are in great pain. Moreover, a crevice has been fixed between us and you. Those who wish to cross over from here to you cannot, neither can anyone cross from there to us." The rich man said, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house. I have 5 brothers. He needs to warn them so they don't come to this place of agony." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They must listen to them." The rich man said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they'll change their hearts and lives." Abraham said, "If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, then neither will they be persuaded if someone rises from the dead." Friends, hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people. You may be seated. Let the words of my mouth and meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. I had an opportunity a few years ago, just before Rebecca was born, to have surgery on my eyes at half price. And so I took advantage of it. But one of the things that happens after LASIK surgery or after PRK, which is what I had done, is that your eyes can become a little more sensitive to light and brightness and glare. And so when I'm driving, I consistently wear sunglasses. How many of y'all wear sunglasses driving or just going outside or something, right? Yeah, so you're kind of familiar with this thing. They make me look cool, which is kind of fun, because I'm not usually cool. Noah says I look like Stan Lee, because they're like big aviators with a big line over the top. They're fun, and maybe it's their job to make me look cool. Maybe not. If my sunglasses make me look cool at all, it's only a secondary function. Cool has to start from within anyway, right? You can't cover up an ugly personality enough ever to be cool. That's not their job. My sunglasses they're filters. They're polarized, and so their job is to cut down on glare and brightness. And they do pretty well at that. For a cheap pair of polarized sunglasses, I'm not about to pay $100 or $200 for sunglasses, because I know what I do with them. I either break them or I lose them. So they're inexpensive. Their job, and they do it pretty well, is to make some things easier to see by, reducing certain areas of the visible light spectrum and certain angles of reflected light. And so, in essence, they enhance what I see by blocking out some of what I don't need to. It's a little akin to what happens to produce some of the most striking images that we have of the universe outside of our solar system. How many of y'all are familiar with the Hubble Space Telescope? Right? Good. That's a good number of us. All right? It orbits around the Earth, out in space. It's like the size of a large, I don't know, not a school bus, but something smaller. Maybe a 15-passenger van, something like that. It's big. And it's a whole bunch of metal and glass and reflective stuff, and it's got one of the most perfect mirrors that humanity has ever produced. But what it takes into its lenses and processes is a broader range of the electromagnetic radiation spectrum than our eyes are capable of taking in. And this is probably science that you already know. You guys are smart people. Our level of education is generally pretty high in America. You know how the human eye is only capable of processing so much information. Right? And that's apart from any psychological blocks that our mind sets up. I don't want to see this thing, so it just doesn't exist. And so we see, for the most part, only what comes to us as visible light, which is the part of the great big electromagnetic spectrum that exists between infrared and ultraviolet. Now, the Hubble Space Telescope doesn't have those limits. It processes a lot more of the electromagnetic spectrum. Of course, we still can't make sense of that because we still can't see it. And so there are these cool algorithms in place to assign data to the spectra that we can't see, but we need to make sense of. And so in the images we receive, that data is assigned visible color. And the images, y'all, they are breathtaking. The filters make it possible, and those algorithms make it possible for us to make sense of data that the body can't process. That's the work that filters do. They make information palatable. Filters always do that work. Linguistic filters make communication clear. Behavioral filters keep relationships healthy. Air filters remove toxins and irritants from our environment. Filters are necessary, and they're good. But they can also be troublesome. Like most things, they're good in moderation. If my sunglasses, for example, were opaque, if they filtered out all light, then you all wouldn't want me on the road. That's the problem that the rich man has created for himself in today's parable. The filter keeping him safe and secure in his home has entirely blocked out the world and the community right outside his door. He is willfully unable to see and address the human need that's desperately sheltering on his front step. And he realizes that just a bit too late. And this is where the parable moves into an image of the separation between the bosom of Abraham and the place of eternal damnation. And here, friends, as a disclaimer, is where I'm going to encourage you to hear Jesus engaging the Pharisees in their own rhetorical game. This is not necessarily a picture that we can depend on of heaven and hell. This is a tool of the Pharisees' own teaching set. And so what's important here is not that Jesus is potentially offering us a glimpse into reality beyond what we can perceive, but rather that Jesus is engaging the Pharisees on their own ground, offering to them a parable that they could have easily created themselves. The rich man has spent his entire life, and probably a good bit of his fortune, setting up walls of brick and walls of practice to protect him from the possibility of losing his wealth. And he's gone so far that his lifestyle denies the mere existence of poverty. He's set up such a filter against poverty that his perspective has become opaque. And in doing so, he's created an impassable chasm between himself and Lazarus. He's condemned himself to the impossibility of experiencing charity. And charity, of course, is a fundamental aspect of God. The Pharisees know that. They just choose to ignore it. They choose to be blind to the plight of the beautiful children of God that they're called to teach. And they set up such filters that their own teaching ignores and creates rhetorical structures to downplay the Torah and downplay the prophets when they repeatedly and earnestly call for the powerful of the land to care for the poor, the widow, the orphan, the alien in their land. And in their anger at Jesus calling them out, they probably won't even hear the hint of hope that rests in this story. Because across that chasm between Lazarus and the rich man, something crosses. Somehow. Across the impassable separation between the self-imposed curse of the rich man and the comfort of Abraham's bosom, a voice echoes. Deep calls to deep. The fathomless abyss of separation from God calls to the incomprehensible well of the love of God, and a voice answers, "Child." I should confess to y'all that I'm not always kind when I address our children who've made foolish choices. And it wouldn't be out of character for Jesus to use another name for the rich man. In fact, do you remember the parable of the rich man who had a plentiful harvest that he'd prepared for himself, and he stored everything up in these shelters, these silos, all this grain and stuff? Remember that story? Hoards it away just for himself, just in case something happens. But God said to him, "Fool, tonight you will die. Now who will get the things you have prepared for yourself? This is the way it will be for those who hoard things for themselves and aren't rich toward God." Fool? I feel like Mr. T ought to say that. Fool? Now that's not the word that echoes across that chasm between the rich man and Lazarus. And I would encourage you to hear Abraham's voice as God's voice. Abraham, in the comfort of glory, speaks on behalf of God. And the word that that voice carries across is child. Maybe that's because here, when the rich man is prepared for himself this impassable chasm, he suddenly realized what he's done and is having a change of heart. He's repenting. And Abraham said, child. It's not demeaning, it's not cruel, it's not cold, it's compassionate. Even here, beyond the 11th hour, after midnight, and into the day of eternity, there is compassion in heaven for the rich man who has spent his life in blind cruelty and greed. Voices cross that chasm. Compassion crosses that chasm. But maybe it's not enough. Maybe it's even more cruel that the rich man realizes what he's done to himself. I mean, living with the guilt of doing violence to another human being is, I don't know what it is. I don't have a word for that. It's bad. Maybe it's unspeakably bad. God can forgive, but can I forgive myself for the violence that I've done? I suspect that the rich man's imprisonment is self-imposed. But it's still imprisonment. Is our self-protection worth the prison of the violence that we do to each other? Is any amount of wealth or comfort worth the damage that we blindly inflict to the faceless poor, the creation that we're called to steward? All the teachings of Moses and the prophets call for the rich man to take Lazarus in, to clean him up, to feed him, to shelter him, to employ him. But he sets up his filters, his walls, and his systemic greed, so he never has to experience the possibility of poverty. I confess to y'all that I haven't been good at it, but our calling is to use all that we are for the upbuilding of God's children. All we are. Not just 10%, not a tithe, which is, I don't know, its foundation biblically is fragile at best. Not just a handful of change. God has given everything of God's self for us. And God expects no less of us. Everything that we do to hoard and to protect and set up filters so that we don't have to see the poverty around us deepens the chasm between us and the bosom of Abraham. We're called to stewardship of all God's children with all that we are. All our time, all our stuff, all our systems, all our intellect, all our compassion. Or to use the words of our covenant as we come into the United Methodist Church, all our prayers, our presence, our gifts, our service, and our witness. All to steward God's most vulnerable children. And maybe one shovelful of compassion at a time, we can start filling that chasm. And maybe one day, the day of God will come, and all God's children will experience the deep well of God's love. But until that day, let's keep trying. Let's make every choice count. Let's lift each other up. Let's fill that chasm with love until by the power of Christ's love, hell itself has been R-A-Z-E-D raised. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.